It might seem like a lot to remember, but it's not. Matt Walsh's mind isn't a mystery or an enigma, no matter how often he may like to say he loves pondering and how often he portrays himself as a learned person. He's not. In fact, Matt Walsh sees the world in a childlike simplicity. It's a world in which he's right. He wears his unwavering conviction, his extremism, like a badge of honor, because not only does he see anyone who believes different to be weaker, less than, but because if Matt learned something, if he was forced to confront the realities behind what he believes, he would see it as weak to have learned something new, and because of how it might affect his other viewpoints. Think of how his fixation with definitions could tie into his disdain for ADHD, which has obvious ties to his spite for an education he didn't feel fulfilled in, but also ties into his perception of having a mental disorder, something that, if he agreed with as a diagnosis, might put him a step closer to empathizing with other people who struggle with mental health issues, like trans people even. Thus, Matt's mind has remained a steel trap to the outside world, no matter what proof is given to counteract his tirades or his appeals to logic and common sense. Because actually learning and applying that knowledge in a way that means growing as a person would mean admitting he's been wrong. It's why we don't need to go over every opinion of his. They're basically all the same. If something is popular or can be considered good by the mainstream, or challenges his opinions in any way, he sees it as bad. So what happens when someone willfully doesn't learn? They have strong convictions based on nothing but their personal feelings. They defend it by appealing to facts and logic, despite purposefully abandoning a pursuit of facts and logic through education. What happens when someone dislikes everything that doesn't fit into his narrow worldview, and he's given a platform? The result is you'll find Matt Walsh doesn't seem to like much of anything, because seemingly everything threatens his worldview in one way or another, and his inflexibility and incuriosity are foundational to that. Which is why, as we get closer to the end here, I'm going to make the case that more than anything else, Matt Walsh may dislike himself the most. Matt's status as a curmudgeon is well known, as in even the people he works for and with don't seem to like spending time with him. And it's not like Matt tries to be likable. In keeping with his need to cover everything in a slathering of half-irony, he constantly presents himself as unlikable, demanding and rude, but as a joke. It's the affect he's adopted, though it's too authentic to be playing a character. Take a look at this video where he's supposed to be greeting Candace Owens as she comes to the Daily Wire. The video as a whole is a spectacular look into how Matt does when he's unscripted. It's meant to be a fun, humanizing piece, just showing coworkers welcoming a new member, showing them around, joking a bit, and it works for the most part, despite the awful things these people have said, the horrible lies they've told and profited from. In this video, at least, they appear to be regular coworkers like any other. Except for Matt.
What is the best piece of advice that you can give me?
Stay the hell out of my way.
Granted, Matt has been open about his introversion, his discomfort in public situations. He even once went on an extended diatribe about how annoying people who make small, polite talk are. And we see some of that in his video. He gets visibly more comfortable, his body language opens up, but still, even as Candace does her best to laugh off the way he shoots down her questions, it's plain to see he's just a fun sponge. Matt being unscripted is something he's never been good at, especially against political rivals. While he's safe and sound behind his desk where he can offer his opinions without proof, he's been routinely embarrassed in public. It's probably why the toughest intellectual opponents he will take on now are college students he can debate with an audience already on his side. The best example, and really a showcase of Matt's various arguments, is the infamous Dr. Phil interview, where Matt ended up looking like a piss baby throwing a tantrum as people more educated and qualified calmly diffused his impassioned arguments to the cheers of a studio audience.
I mean, I could sit here and say that I feel like a tomato plant, but that doesn't mean that I'm actually in those things. So your self-perception, you can have whatever self-perception you want, but you can't expect me to take part in that self-perception or to take part in this kind of charade, this theatrical production. You don't get your own pronouns, just like you don't get your own prepositions or your own adjectives. You know, it's like if I were to tell you, my adjectives are handsome and brilliant, and no matter whenever you're talking about me, you have to describe me as handsome and brilliant because that's how I identify. It makes no sense. You don't get your own pronouns. That's grammar. That's language.
So you think it's a delusion? Someone is self-delusional?
Yeah, I think it's delusion. It could be mental illness. It could be it's a lot of different things. With children, wow. You know, there's also just a basic confusion that all kids have. Like that's why when you hear.
When the interview starts, Matt is immediately offensive. He basically calls the non-binary person mentally ill to their face. So there's that old dehumanizing. Throughout, Matt is incredibly rude, interrupting Addison and growing visibly more frustrated and louder even as Addison maintains a calm demeanor and consistently answers his questions.
Your definition is that a woman is someone who is female, you said, right?
Correct, is a biological female.
So what happens if we have maybe someone who is female, identifies as a woman, right? You know, cisgender woman, right? As you just explained, but maybe doesn't have the ability to reproduce. Maybe doesn't have those organs that you're talking about that are reproductive organs.
I have answered the question. You stood up here and said trans women are women.
Yes.
Tell me what you mean. What is a woman?
Womanhood is something that, just as Ethan explained, I cannot define because I am not
But
myself.
you used the word, so what did you mean when you said trans women are women if you don't know what it means?
Right? So here's the thing. So I do not define what a woman is because I do not identify as a woman. Womanhood is something that is an umbrella term. It includes people
That describes what?
people who identify as a woman.
Identify as what?
As a woman.
What is that?
What's to each their own. Each woman, each man, each person is going to have a different relation with their own gender identity and define it differently. And so
I'm not
trans
asking you
women are women too.
Okay.
Their answers are concise and well considered, far from the impulsivity in trans people he likes to chalk up as children who don't know what they are yet. And Matt hates that. This is purely speculation, but I think that really he hates that someone might have come to this level of self-understanding and self-acceptance on their own. Something he, in his self-deprecating sarcasm, can't seem to do. Addison smartly picks apart Matt's constant need to put every singular definition into an accurate, all-consuming box. They continue to point out that the conversation around gender and gender roles is bigger than what can be defined in one word. And when Matt realizes he's losing the audience, he launches personal attacks. He claims the non-binary person who is clear about not identifying as a woman is trying to appropriate womanhood as a costume.
And you want to reduce
you won't even tell me what the word means, though. So
you
that's
want to
the
reduce
problem.
women, you want to reduce men down to maybe just their genetics, our genitals, our chromosomes, right? That's what you're
What
saying.
you want to do is
that's
what you want to do is appropriate women. You want to appropriate womanhood, and turn it into basically a costume that can be worn. We've got when we. It's real funny. It's real funny. It's real funny when you're.
Right. As a man, you're literally saying this is what a woman is.
Yeah. Well,
Isn't that a little sexist?
And Matt, of course, would cut this video up as highlights, but the next part is what you might not have seen. See, it's easy for Matt to show off the video where he owns a feminine person with a beard and defends women, but what about when he's faced down by a college professor who's a cis woman with an educated background on the subject? A background Matt has proudly eschewed, remember.
Why is it important for educators to teach about gender identity, gender presentation, and pronouns? Why do you think that's important?
Because there is a difference. There is biological sex, and a lot of times people are conflating sex and gender. So there's biological sex, and then there's gender, and that's a social construct in the sense that just because you're born biologically a female doesn't mean you automatically want to vacuum, for instance, which is usually a feminine activity or conflated that way. And so it's this idea of giving children in age-appropriate ways an understanding that these things aren't set in stone. Gender identity is not tied to biology.
You say that gender's not set in stone.
It's not.
What do you mean?
I mean that's just factually incorrect saying that. So you have biology is the chromosomal makeup and reproductive organs and all of that. And so that would be sort of the nature side of things. But the nurture side of things is where we see more of gender identities.
She began by saying that my view is extreme. Okay, so the view that every single person on Earth has held up until 15 seconds ago is extreme, and the view that almost everyone does right now still hold is extreme, apparently, according to her. But there is this complete.
Matt, despite starting his previous argument that Addison was mentally unwell and had spoken nonsense, his words, he then takes umbrage with the professor calling his view extreme, something he shouldn't really have a problem with, right? She openly laughs at him as he tries to present his argument as based in logic while not really making sense in how he's presenting it. And what's the result?
So if you can laugh all you want, but this is a logical problem. You are conflating sex and gender just by saying that. So that's the problem.
There's biological sex, and then there is gender identity. Part of me wants to ask why you care so much, because it's really not that big of a deal.
Can I answer that? I'd love to answer that question. I care about the truth. So basic truth matters. I want to live in a society where people care about the truth and we're grounded in truth. Right. I care about children, and these insane ideas about gender are being foisted on kids.
Again, Matt doesn't give any concise logical reasoning, not really. He tries to appeal to emotion by telling the crowd he cares about the truth, and it's largely just a ramble of talking points that nobody in the crowd is receptive to. Also, Pay attention to Matt's body language here. He's far from the casual, comfortable jokester he slips into being on young American college seminars, where he has a captive audience of young, malleable, conservative minds. No, his head is noticeably more shiny. He's started stumbling over his words, and even though he tries to reel in his emotion compared to the calculated responses from people he's calling insane and mentally ill, he can't help but look like the one without a hold on his mental state. There's a point in the interview where he even stops meeting the eyes of his debaters, even as they continue looking at him. It doesn't help Matt that the next person they introduce on his side of the argument immediately regards Addison with respect.
First of all, thank you for having me. And I wanted to say I honor you and your journey and where you are in life. And it has nothing to do with that. We're here about our kids.
It's damning with faint praise, but it only serves to make Matt's outburst look even worse in this marketplace of ideas. Matt brings up a case he misrepresents, but manages to sensationalize the rape aspect to make trans people look like dangerous predators.
Loudoun County is a famous case that the Daily Wire we helped uncover. There was a gender non-conforming boy in a dress who went into a girl's restroom and violently raped a young girl. After that happened, that's when the school district decided, oh, you know what? Now we're going to open up the restrooms and invite the boys in with the girls.
The law protecting trans kids' bathrooms wasn't passed until months after the alleged assault. And despite what Matt says, the mother of the child has testified that he's not trans or non-binary, so Matt is just using the most incendiary rhetoric he can to get the audience back on his side. Again, not facts, feelings, not logic, an agenda. Matt continues his generalization game he's honed so well, where he takes one opposing position and makes it seem like everyone he disagrees with is hellbent on it, despite the professor again speaking up.
We want privacy in our facilities. We don't want a man in the bathroom with us. And then what we hear
Most
from
people want
this side,
privacy in the bathroom.
what we hear from this side.
I did not say that we want open bathrooms where anyone can go in.
What we hear from this side is that, well, their feelings don't matter. We're not going. Who cares? You just have to deal with it, right? Because the transgender people, the gender nonconforming people, it's their feelings that take priority.
Matt's body language grows even more tensed up when even Addison agrees that people should be entitled to their privacy in spaces, including extending those rights to trans people.
People should be allowed to have boundaries around who's in their space, too. And if you have people who are constantly putting you into a box that you do not identify with, if people are constantly seeing you in a way that you are not being seen and stuff, too, it's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting, right? You have to imagine that. So for us, if we don't hang out with certain people who don't understand us, that's okay. But we will try to keep an open conversation going.
Yeah, I would think you wouldn't seek those people out.
Right.
I would think you'd get up every day and go find Matt Walsh and spend, spend the day with him. But I would think he would be somebody that you would want to have an ongoing dialogue with because y'all disagree. And it seems like we should just keep the dialogue going and hopefully find some middle ground.
Now, of course, all of this doesn't change that as soon as Matt was done, he didn't have a problem talking about how weak his opponents were and how little they've ever been challenged.
Someone like me would be out there. I don't know if they knew it was me. They might have known it was me. They just didn't know who I was. So they knew that there'd be someone supposedly on the other side. And they've probably had discussions like this in the past with somebody, quote unquote, on the other side. But what they're used to and what they expect is that they're not actually going to be challenged. You know,
they're just being
they thought that I would. Right. They thought I'd have a few basic talking points and that I wouldn't really challenge them.
Maybe that's because you weren't really a challenge for them, Matt. Now, he, of course, made more content on this, and he definitely wasn't mad about how his intelligence and acumen came off. He's definitely not defensive at all.
Then they brought a woke professor in, who's a communications professor, but somehow she's their gender expert. They brought her in, and so it's 3 against 1. And I had the entire audience that was against me, which may seem like that doesn't matter, but actually optically, like that's a challenge. Because when, as we saw in the clip there, you heard in the clip, if someone says something and it's totally inane and ridiculous, but they get applause in the crowd, it makes it sound like they're right. And so that's another hurdle you have to get over in a debate. Of course, I knew that I would be outnumbered on stage in front of a hostile studio audience. And if I had been invited to speak about a more complicated or difficult issue, one that requires you to actually be smart, then that would have given me pause. But the topic of the episode was gender and pronouns, which means that it's not complicated or difficult at all. My position, the correct position, is extremely simple, sensible, obvious, and clear. The only mistake that somebody on my side of the issue can make, and very often people do make this mistake, in a debate of this kind, is to make the subject seem more complicated than it is, getting lost in the rhetorical weeds and losing sight of the main point. That's where the other side lives. They're out there in the weeds where things are muddy and muddled. They like it out there. They want to obscure the main point, mystifying what is actually quite simple. As long as you refuse to be baited into that trap and you stay on message, on the firm ground of truth and science and common sense, You can have this conversation anywhere, with anybody, on any platform, in front of any audience, and you will walk away the winner every time.
This video is fascinating because he basically makes up an entire rhetorical structure to explain how he actually won the debate, despite the audience being against him, being easily outmaneuvered, and constantly looking like a baby. And of course, there's the other big clip where Matt just throws out an erroneous fact on Joe Rogan's podcast, which Joe, for once, actually fact-checks.
You're talking about hormone blockers.
Yeah.
Millions of kids have been on hormone blockers, really?
I'm sure someone's going to fact check me on it, but my guess is that we're into the millions now at this point.
A few moments later. That's a very small number, if that's right.
It says over the last 5 years, there were at least 4,780 adolescents who started puberty blockers and had a prior gender dysphoria diagnosis.
This says it's kind of undercounted, but that
would be a big undercounting.
Less than 1,000 people a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would guess, hundreds of thousands at this, but I could be wrong.
Rogan has an infamously broken bullshit detector, so it's somewhat notable that this figure by Matt was so batshit crazy, even the king of Jim Bro Mountain raised an eyebrow. So yeah, for fairly obvious reasons, despite his huge platform and dedication to his positions, Matt stays in his bubble, a safe space if you will, because even from high atop his podium at college events, he can dunk on teenagers who might not speak nearly as well in public as he does, and he can bet that even if someone gets a good question off, the crowd at his Young America rallies are going to boo them and will be on his side. It's a home field advantage. However, that still hasn't stopped Matt from looking dumb on a couple occasions.
We've never seen anybody walk on water, but there are so many stories of people who have been changed by by God. They've seen the light of God, and so you sort of turn a blind eye to science, right? We're gonna need science because it's for our benefit.
We're gonna let someone else ask a few questions.
I'm kind of scared of the answer.
Before you walk away, though, hey, wait a minute. Because anyone who comes up, and if you want to argue with me about the trans stuff, it's great. I'm glad we can have the conversation. But we're talking about truth. We're talking about biological sex. So I always have to ask the question at the end. I mean, everyone knows what the question's going to be. But so what is a woman? Can you define the term?
Like, Matt's religion here is being called into question, and he just runs like a little bitch. Or like this one, where a trans person dissects his arguments quite elegantly, providing their own medical training and evidence of modern biology and science, things Matt just hand waves away to the howling praise of the auditorium.
Through my training in healthcare, there are several different categories for how we define sex. People bring up chromosomes. People also bring up hormone levels. People bring up all sorts of other categories. Lots of people don't fit neatly into a gender binary, even people we don't consider to be intersex. It's a complicated spectrum.
It's not complicated, but you also didn't define. So what is a woman? What is a female? What do these words mean?
It's complicated, and I know you're not going to like that answer, but that's because there are no simple answers in human biology.
Let me ask you a question.
You guys,
well,
hang on. Just let me finish. You guys like to bring up high school level biology classes a lot. I get that a lot, but people who go on to more complicated biology classes will talk about sex as a spectrum.
It's not. It's not.
Well, biological researchers would disagree with you.
Well, and they're full of the ones that would say that.
Also, what does it say about his own educational prowess that the game he primarily decides to hunt are teenagers who are still learning things he supposedly exhibits mastery over? It's like being a black belt in a karate class full of 5th graders. It's because that's the safest place Matt can be, except of course behind his desk. But even then, Matt's output is filled with assumptions and inconsistencies that back up his worldview, but can be undone with the simplest of Google searches. For example, this video he did hating on Sam Smith.
A few years later, Smith came out as gender queer, explaining that he, quote, feels as much like a woman as a man. He was, of course, never asked to explain what the hell that's supposed to mean, or how he knows what a woman feels like, or how he delineates between man feelings and woman feelings. It's good for his sake that he wasn't asked these questions, because he wouldn't have been able to answer them, because the term genderqueer is completely meaningless.
If Matt had actually looked it up, he would have known Sam has done several interviews talking about gender fluidity and identity. But instead, Matt just continues to berate them.
Granted, he might be the first pop star to go this direction while looking like he plays right tackle on the Detroit Lions practice squad. Though on second thought, I guess Lizzo has him beat there as well. So even on that point, he's not the first. So Smith's latest musical effort may not be risky, may not be bold, may not be revolutionary, but it is, at least, we will admit, totally repulsive and grotesque.
So what do you get when you have someone who wants to force their opinions on others, but who gets outflanked and outmaneuvered whenever they branch out to the world beyond the one that coddles them? What happens when that person has a deep and obvious streak of sarcasm they use to cover for their own perceived faults, and to keep from examining themselves too closely? You get the Matt Walsh show, where Matt can say whatever he wants, act as tough and incendiary as possible, and nobody will do anything about it except give him the attention he so desperately craves. As a curmudgeon, Matt often goes on unrelated tirades about pop culture and how it's simply filled with idiots, like this blog post that was supposed to be about Psy playing for the Obamas, but instead became this rant. Of course, back in those days, someone like Kim Kardashian would be an opium-smoking gypsy living in an obscure Midwestern commune. Now she's an international billionaire philanthropist, and a show like Buck Wild on MTV would be such a disastrous flop it would surely end the careers of everyone involved. Now it's the next big reality TV phenomenon. And a book like 50 Shades of Grey would be burned in a giant bonfire, not for being provocative, but for being absolutely retarded. Now it's hailed as a modern literary classic. I don't know anybody who would call 50 Shades of Grey a literary classic. Matt, it was just a popular book. I feel like most people knew it was bad. It's like people saying Sharknado is a classic of cinema. Although that one might be true. In one of his many tirades against pop music, Matt goes on about the artlessness of modern art. He makes appeals to beauty as a concept, I guess. And he references the Pietà and Song of Solomon as good examples of art. Quote, even if you won't boycott pop music for morality's sake, at least give it up for your brain's sake. You gave up the artificial sugar because you didn't want diabetes. Now give up Beyonce and those like her because you don't want to be stupid. Yes, the music is inappropriate, degrading, and offensive, but it's also incredibly awful, outrageously, aggressively stupid. I'm not talking about stupid in a fun-loving slapstick kind of way. I'm talking about stupid in a bland, pathetic, makes your brain cells commit suicide kind of way. This is the only reason why I'm hesitant to jump on the Miley Cyrus, Beyonce, Katy Perry / whoever outrage bandwagon. We act as though these people are artist provocateurs, intentionally jabbing at society's taboos in order to make a bold, anarchistic statement. But Picasso, they ain't. These pop products have no vision. They have no critique to levy or declaration to make. They're empty shells. They're carefully constructed corporate constructions. That's redundant. Singing and behaving with the wisdom and maturity of 7th graders because that's what sells. Of course, these are the exact same criticisms he's shilling today, and you know what? I almost agree with Matt. I've never liked pop music, like ever. I hated it in high school. I hated being made to listen to it at events and parties. Now though, it's not as much a part of my personality because I have a wide assortment of musical tastes that I'd rather indulge in than just pissing on one genre. I'm over here listening to The Highwaymen 2 and KMFDM on repeat while I edit this probably, and next week I might be on another BB King kick, who knows? The artistic potential of the world is so vast and untapped, I don't understand why anyone would spend so long fixating on things that they don't like when you can just find so many new things you will. Matt doesn't like much about pop culture, it seems, no matter how accomplished or classically based. For example, in this 2012 post, he hates Les Miserables. If it wasn't abundantly clear by now, Matt rarely seems to understand the media he critiques. He calls Les Mis, quote, utterly pointless tale of an ex-con as he tries to elude a bumbling parole officer for 20 years, which is certainly a way to describe one of the most important and influential works of Western literature and a landmark musical. But Matt didn't like it, so ever the critic, he tries to really dig into why it didn't resonate with him. Quote, but it's a classic. No, it's not. Who cares if the play has been around for a while? Malaria has been around for a while. Just because something is old doesn't make it a classic. Quality stuff, Matt. Great critique. Here's the thing. Matt, as we've seen earlier, loves to tout the benefits of classical art, but if something being old doesn't make it classic, do you think Matt could articulate why certain pieces are classic? I mean, not without probably reading some books on art, but I doubt any art historian worth their salt would agree with Matt, who loves to call all modern and abstract art worthless garbage. Oh, and here's him hating on Star Wars. Pay attention to his lack of suspension of disbelief. Gosh, he must be so fun at parties.
Going cold. It's really not that good. Script is not good. The dialogue is clunky and everything. I mean, it's kind of campy and kind of fun, I guess, but it's not. My point is, it's really not a great film. All of this technology and you're using a sword to fight people. You're telling me you couldn't come up with a weapon that would make that sword irrelevant. And if a guy comes at you with a laser sword, you could just shoot him, right? And that'd be the end of it. Now, I know you're going to say, oh, well, they could block what you see in the movie. They block the lasers with their sword. Yeah, that's because the laser guns, the lasers that come out of the lasers and the laser guns are super slow. You see how slow those lasers are? They go at the speed of a Nerf bullet. And that's why they're so easy to block. And everyone gets on the stormtroopers case when they say the joke is the stormtroopers can't hit anybody and they got the worst aim in the galaxy. But the reason is that the lasers are going so slow, so they're easy to dodge. So why not make a gun with a laser that goes the speed of an actual laser? And in lieu of that, just get a regular gun, like a sawed-off shotgun. And you could kill every Jedi in the galaxy, no problem. These people never pause to consider whether the content they're forcing down your gullet is good or worthwhile, whether it helps you to be a smarter, better, more interesting person, whether it makes your life better. Like, these are actually things you should consider before consuming any content. I know it's sort of unimaginable that you would take these into consideration at all. They never ask themselves if people actually want to watch and listen to the slop they're putting on these streaming services and in movie theaters. They just expect that you'll be horrified at the prospect that all this stuff is no longer available, that the morphine drip of content has been shut down.
Let's ponder that and watch this little conversation on how he does define good entertainment.
It is possible to be entertained with your brain on, so that your mind is also being engaged in some way. And that's a much deeper, more fulfilling, more enjoyable, more entertaining form of entertainment. But if you keep your brain on and you try to engage with Ariana Grande or Beyonce or whoever, you're just going to be bored to death. So you've got to make this effort to turn it off. And yeah, maybe every once in a while it doesn't hurt to do that. Maybe every once in a while it doesn't hurt to turn your brain off and really enjoy something completely stupid. Okay, maybe that doesn't hurt. Although it never really helps, but maybe it doesn't hurt. But the problem is that most people are indulging in this turn off your brain entertainment every day for hours at a time. They turn their brain off and they never turn it back on. They say, oh, sometimes you got to turn your brain off. And the only response to that is, sometimes? What do you mean sometimes? This is what you always do. You never have your brain on. Every form of entertainment that you enjoy it requires you to turn your brain off. So, and you're always being entertained by something. So when exactly are you turning it back on? Art can be a very, very uplifting experience. And it can be edifying. And it can be enlightening. And I'm not just talking about religious art. I mean any art that is rooted in something true and that brings you closer to truth. Any art that illuminates in some way. And I think all art should do that. But most art today has no connection to anything real, and instead it exists for its own sake. It exists only to distract. It exists to appeal to the basest parts of us. And I think that certainly does hurt our souls, as well as our brains.
This entire video is a good example of how Matt just gets enraged by something and comes up with a justification why on the fly. He talks for 22 minutes about something, but doesn't actually say much. He also doesn't offer any real alternatives.
It's not like they're balancing that with Shakespeare and documentaries about military history, it's intellectually substantive. No, that's not what's happening. Their whole life revolves around the turn your brain off stuff. They say, oh, what do you mean Elvis? Well, Elvis is a classic because he was, how could you say? No, the music is just kind of garbage. It's like, what's it trying to say? What's it doing? What's the point of it? What was the point of most of what the Beatles were churning out? It's just, I submit that if we could turn back the clock to the 40s and 50s and just go off on a completely different path, and all the pop music, it never came about, I think we'd be in a better spot today. I'm not saying that we'd be in a utopian spot. I don't even know how, I don't know to what degree we'd be in a better spot, because there are so many other problems as well, but I think we'd be in a better spot. I don't think the world was made better by any of this stuff, personally.
I guess he balances his criticism of pop culture with what he considers good and interesting, like military documentaries. Despite hating hoity-toity musicals and constantly espousing the value of traditional masculinity, he considers himself above things even like Fast and Furious. It must be so exhausting to pick a movie night with this guy. This article is just another example of Matt's constant, sarcastic, self-congratulatory whinging, but I threw it in to show the wide array of things he seems to have no patience for. Not action movies, not musicals, not pop music, not science fiction, not modern art, not modern books. All because he constructs these reasons why they're inherently bad. And if that wasn't exhausting enough, he doesn't like other people. It should be well assumed by now he doesn't like their opinions, their presence, their rights to sentience, the choices they make. He doesn't like that other people might inconvenience his existence or ask for common courtesy or respect. His general unfocused disdain extends to people without denomination or affiliation. He simply imagines people to get mad at, like in this post-decrying Black Friday where he just calls random shoppers pudgy cheapskates. Quote, in response, employees of these chains have filed petitions with their management protesting the move. These lazy bastards apparently think it's more important to enjoy fellowship with their families. Pfft, families, who needs them, am I right? than to sell flat screens to hordes of pudgy cheapskates. End quote. Matt has an inability to see anything from another perspective, to place himself in someone else's shoes. Empathy. It's plain to see in so many of his arguments, like his callous, cold reaction to women getting their healthcare rights taken away. He doesn't see things as his problem because they don't affect him personally. He sees things as other people's problems that they need to fix because they annoy him more than anything else. In one blog post, he rails against emotional support animals, something that is commonly used to help people he should be for helping, like military vets suffering from PTSD, or just people with disabilities. Quote, emotional support animal? Bullcrap. Plain and simple, ridiculous, embarrassing, asinine. And I only say that because the designation allows the owner to claim a fabricated disability and then walk around and impose their animal on everyone else, and sue anyone who puts up a fuss. For God's sake, people, we used to build bridges and storm beaches and smoke cigars in bowling alleys and make John Wayne movies in this country. End quote. So, at least it seems he likes John Wayne movies.
You return empty-handed from the chase, my son?
Not so, fine gazelle.
Now we seek bigger game, Hunlin.
How many markets did you observe?
30? No more.
We'll take twice that number. Call Bagurci and Sabaya.
Big John Wayne fan. I've seen almost all of his movies, and I love all of them, especially, The Searchers, True Grit, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, Quiet Man. I mean, the classics. These are classic films.
Arguably as stupid as any Fast and Furious movie, but within of the familia.
It's family.
So let's talk about Matt Walsh's transphobia. There's plenty that can be said about Matt Walsh's subtle racism and his constant justification of Native American genocide. I'll play these quick clips to give some examples.
Of course, we're obsessed with problematic. We gotta sift through the lives of all the historical figures, tear down the statues. We're worried about problematic historical figures. But the only historical figures we're still allowed to honor are Indian warlords from 200 years ago that raped and killed children. This is what happened in Indian tribes. It was the case everywhere without exception. They stole from each other, they killed, they kidnapped, they conquered, and so on, over and over again, century upon century. This is one of the many reasons why this whole land acknowledgement thing is ludicrous. So he says, while you're celebrating your 4th of July, don't forget whose land you stole to celebrate your freedom. Okay. When you say the land that you stole, you're referring to white settlers hundreds of years ago. Here's my next question. When they moved in and took land, did they steal from the tribe that occupied that land at the time, or from the tribe that tribe stole it from? Or from the tribe that stole it from? These tribes, all of them, live by the law of conquest. If you want it, you take it. If you have it and you want to keep it, you defend it. If you have it and you want to keep it and you can't defend it, you lose it. So the white man showed up, and in some cases they played by the same rules. They didn't invent them. If a tribe gets moved off their land by white people, but they had just moved other people off the land, they're thieves also. So who's the victim? I can never quite get an answer to that question. It's important when we engage with these ideas like diversity and inclusion that we don't make the mistake of accepting the premise that the left actually wants diversity and inclusion. I mean, that would be bad enough if that is what they wanted. Diversity and inclusion are terrible goals in and of themselves, especially for a military, but really for any institution. Diversity and inclusion should never be the priority. And if they were the real priorities here, there would be plenty to criticize about that. But we should also keep in mind that all of these words, diversity, inclusion, equity, tolerance, etc., they're all code for get rid of white males. And that's really what this is about. And so there are really two parts of the story. The first is the story itself, which is the demographic trend, where whites are trending towards extinction in the United States. Like that's the way it's headed.
What?
And then the other part of the story is the veil of silence around this issue, the wall that is erected around it. I know you're going to say, well, you just read a story about it, so it's not a silence. They can report on it. So you report and you celebrate diversity, and then you just move on. We don't talk about it, we don't think much about it, and that's it. You aren't allowed to talk much about it. You certainly can't be concerned about it. You're not allowed to express any concern. That's unthinkable. It was becoming a predominantly white country rather than predominantly black. This would be considered a major, major problem. And there's no doubt about it. And yet, in the reverse, it is either neutral or cause for celebration. But really, it should be a cause for celebration.
No one's celebrating anything.
And you know what? This pertains even to the animal kingdom. I mean, you can think of there's a particular type of, hummingbird.
Okay, that's a species discourse.
Even for that, we're supposed to panic. If I were to say, hey, whatever, what does it matter? So we don't have that type of hummingbird. We got plenty of other hummingbirds. It doesn't matter what type of hummingbird it is. The difference doesn't make.
White people are platypus.
So yeah, this type of hummingbird is, there's more of that and there's less of this. Like, who cares? If I say that, I'm callous.
But sorry, Matt Walsh definitely does not give a shit about any animal going extinct. So what kind of concern is he trying to drape himself in here?
Also, if 52% of the birds in a place were hummingbirds, we wouldn't be saying they're on the road to extinction. That would be ridiculous.
Yeah, because their voting power relative to robins is decreased.
But ultimately, I'm not fully equipped to pick apart why Matt's arguments are so based in white supremacy and the traditionalist casserole racism he promotes. I am, however, equipped to handle Matt's opinions on trans people. And really, trans people are the nexus of Matt Walsh's qualities. All of his arguments, his fixations with definitions, with facts and logic, with flattening his opposition's opinions. And he loves talking about trans people because he can always try and hide behind facts and logic.
Over the last few years, though, a certain madness has gripped hold of an increasingly large number of people. What was once simple and straightforward suddenly became a subject for debate. And one side of that debate decided that in fact, even if a man has a penis and XY chromosomes, and a male bone structure and male reproductive organs and any of the other biological indicators that are unique to men, he may still be a woman. No scientific explanation has ever been offered for this.
He's been doing this shtick for a while, falling back into the most bog standard definitions long before what is a woman. If there's one thing Matt has been stubbornly consistent about, it's trans people. In this 2013 blog post, he scathingly rebukes progressives for accepting a young trans girl, saying, quote, "Leave it to the pro-science folks to actually assert that our genetic and biological realities can somehow be altered just because we want them to be. That's just not an inaccurate view. It's intensely anti-scientific and brazenly dogmatic." End quote. Interesting to note here, Matt's appeal to science. It's honestly interchangeable with how he appeals to facts or common sense or logic, in that it's usually the only actual proof he will provide. He's not very into citing actual studies and actual medical journals, and when he's confronted with them, likes to hand-wave them away.
To more complicated biology classes, we'll talk about sex as a spectrum.
It's not. It's not.
Well, biological researchers would disagree with you.
Well, and they're full of the ones that would say that. This is a logical problem. You are conflating sex and gender just by saying that. So that's the problem.
There's biological sex, and then there is gender identity. Part of me wants to ask why you care so much, because it's really not that big of a deal.
Oh, yeah, can I answer that? I'd love to answer that question. I care about the truth. So basic truth matters. I want to live in a society where people care about the truth and we're grounded in truth. Right. I care about children, and these insane ideas about gender are being foisted on kids, and that bothers me quite a bit. I care about the women who are having their opportunities stolen from them. I care quite a bit, yeah.
You are a champion for women.
On that note, do you ever notice how there's not a lot of right-wing video essayists? I mean, people like H-Bomber Guy or Sean. There are a lot of people who yell at a video clip or a news story for grifting points, but not a lot of people who will really dig into the nuance of an issue and cite plenty of well-documented and researched sources. It's easy, anyone can do it. Yet, for some reason, not a lot of right-wingers do. I mean, Matt, I learned how to cite sources in college, but you don't need to go to college to just Google something and see if it's true. However, as we've already seen, and as he clearly demonstrates in What is a Woman, his debates, and plenty of other places, Matt's grasp on the scientific side of the trans issue is a bit feeble. One of my favorite encapsulations of how Matt just mangles his arguments is this reaction video he did to a John Oliver special on trans rights.
John Oliver, who hosts a slightly more popular but still little-watched show on HBO, has also made a career out of this same tactic. Oliver has earned a reputation on the left for thoroughly demolishing conservative arguments. A reputation that is relatively easy for him to maintain because nobody actually watches his show to find out if it's accurate or not.
His defensive streak shows right off the bat when he talks about how few people watch John Oliver. For reference, stats show 464,000 views per episode on John Oliver's show, and that particular episode had 4.5 million views on YouTube. Compared to Matt's views, it kind of feels like a little jealousy. We then get his dehumanizing approach to the issue.
Now, first of all, it is the grammatically correct gender-neutral pronoun. A human being who is neither male nor female, if such a creature existed, which it doesn't, would indeed be an it. It is a singular pronoun, whereas they, in most cases, is a pronoun that indicates multiple individuals. Now, is it dehumanizing? Yes, obviously it is. But a person who rejects their male or female identity has already dehumanized themselves or itself.
He praises Abigail Shrier and the book that's been widely debunked, and then kind of shows John Oliver's debunking, but pretends it doesn't happen, and just begins to cite his own knowledge of the subject and resort to his regular insecure lashing out.
Jumping ahead a bit, Oliver goes after Abigail Shrier, who's the author of the great book Irreversible Damage, about the trans epidemic claiming the minds and lives of countless adolescent girls. But Oliver sees no issue with millions of girls suddenly all at once in unison deciding that they're really boys. This is perfectly normal, John Oliver insists.
Shrier sometimes dresses her argument up by using the term rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is total horseshit. It comes from a study published by a researcher in 2018 hypothesizing that some kids identify as trans due to peer pressure. But it's worth you knowing that study was based on a survey of parents, not actual trans kids, and it targeted parents from organizations dedicated to opposing trans ideology, which is instantly disqualifying. It's like citing a study claiming that all postal workers are terrifying hell demons sent to attack your family, but then learning that the researchers only surveyed a collection of anxious dogs. That's some heavy sampling bias that clearly skewed your results. And to be very clear, there is ample evidence of gender variance throughout human history, and as far back as historians have found evidence of trans people, they found trans children. As for the rapid rise in kids identifying as trans, as the writer Julia Serrano has pointed out, when you look at a chart of left-handedness among Americans over the 20th century, you see a massive spike when we stopped forcing kids to write with their right hand, and then a plateau. That doesn't mean everyone became left-handed, or that there was a rapid onset southpaw dysphoria. It means people were free to be who they were.
Okay. All of that should go without saying, nonsense. First of all, we don't need a study to tell us that rapid onset gender dysphoria exists any more than I need to read a study drawing a link between the proliferation of fast food and obesity. Such studies do exist, but people with functioning brains can draw obvious common sense conclusions without needing permission from a research paper to do it.
I'll link to one of my favorite reviews of Abigail Shrier's book down below, which points out the discredited science the author cites and says she's, quote, weirdly obsessed with the internet, which does sound like the average gender-critical feminist. He then goes into justifying the methods of the study as correct despite all evidence to the contrary. Note how Matt continues getting angrier, calling John an idiot with a lack of integrity. Definitely not mad.
No kid is casually dropping into an operating room because they just decided to get their uterus removed with the impulsive recklessness normally associated with getting bangs. Because that is an absolutely ridiculous thing to say.
Yes, it is a ridiculous thing to say, John, which is why nobody is saying it. You have very impressively torched a straw man, but let's get back to the reality. First, John claims that puberty blockers are totally reversible and merely put a pause on puberty. This is simply a lie.
For some, in specific situations, there can be risks to fertility, but for others, the effect is anticipated to be reversible if the medication is discontinued. But there is definitely an informed decision to be made there.
I'm not going to speculate about whether John Oliver is smart enough to know that it's a lie. Everything he says can be explained either by his idiocy or his utter lack of integrity, but it's impossible to know which aspect of his personality is flaring up at any given moment.
He ends by saying John never deals with consent and if kids can consent to medical care, and it makes everything he says irrelevant.
And then he also says that chest masculinization, otherwise known as double mastectomy, only happens if all the people who will make money on the procedure say that it should happen. This is the best defense that Oliver can offer. It's not only dishonest and deceptive and strikingly stupid, but also morally horrifying. And notice the two questions that Oliver avoids. He never grapples with the issue of consent. Can a child under the age of 18 actually consent to any of this? Can a 14-year-old consent to taking a drug that will likely sterilize him? Can a 15-year-old girl consent to having her breasts removed? Oliver spends 30 minutes dancing around the subject, but never once offers his own theory of consent. Of course he doesn't, because he doesn't want to be on the record arguing that a 14-year-old can consent, because he knows how horrifying and creepy and disturbing that would sound. But he also doesn't want to be on the record acknowledging that these things are happening to kids without their consent.
So, out of curiosity, I decided to watch John's video for myself. Would you believe it? Matt left out a few things. Matt leaves out John talking about the open threats of violence inspired by people like him.
And 12 states have signed or enacted them, with all of this happening against a backdrop of violence and threats, including attacks and harassment aimed at hospitals providing gender-affirming care to youth. And frustratingly, there are many on the left who seem at best reluctant to engage on this issue and at worst, outright hostile to it.
He completely misses the parts where John dismantles arguments against trans kids in sports.
People like Noam love stoking fear over the spectre of trans athletes, girls specifically, having an unfair advantage and taking away scholarship opportunities. But there are vanishingly few examples nationwide of trans athletes attempting to compete at all. And in Noam State specifically, the head of their high school sports association could name exactly one transgender female athlete who competed and who graduated several years ago. So there are more athletes in this shot from Noam's ad than there are trans girls known to have competed in South Dakota schools. But even if there were more, discriminating against them would still obviously be wrong, and it would still be weird that state legislatures were getting involved in decisions that are usually made by organisations governing the sports in question. And it is worth knowing, even at the elite level, conversations around this aren't being handled with flat-out bans. The IOC has announced that it will set rules on a sport-by-sport basis, but working on the general principle that no athlete should be excluded from competition on the assumption of an advantage due to their gender. And it is pretty remarkable that a trans athlete could theoretically compete in the Olympics, but not in South Dakota under-12 soccer.
John Oliver also shows Matt collaborator Chris Rufo basically laying out the grift.
So much of the conversation around anti-trans laws involves massively overheated rhetoric that does not match the reality of kids' actual situations. And interestingly, a lot of it's been fueled by some of the same players behind the critical race theory panic, who, as we discussed in February, were using it as a wedge issue to promote school choice. In fact, one key architect of the CRT panic, Christopher Rufo, recently pivoted to attacking trans rights, and he has openly discussed the strategy behind doing that.
What I'm looking at, and it's just kind of an ongoing series, I just started it, is to take that same system of reporting, that same style of reporting as I did with critical race theory, but now taking a look at gender ideology. What's happening right now is parents are feeling that. They're feeling the, oof, this is kind of weird, I'm kind of uncomfortable with this, but I'm scared to speak out. And then we have to give them the language where they can speak about it with confidence, they can speak about it directly, and they can speak about it with the requisite level of aggressiveness that it's gonna take to say, hey, wait a minute, we have to stop this.
Yeah, he's basically giving people a script to repeat.
Turns out Matt cut the part that made Abigail Schreier look like an idiot as well.
Just listen to Abigail Schreier, a vocal proponent of that theory, laying all of this out.
If you want to see brainwash, check out these young teenagers who suddenly decide they're transgender. They immediately cut off their families. They very often drop out of school. They very often start tattooing themselves and using drugs. And they are creating a world for themselves that is so healthy, so built around sexuality, and they lose all their hobbies. Their only hobby is being transgender.
Oh, okay. So there is a lot there, but let me just address the claim that trans kids lose all their hobbies, because I will point out that when they try to have some, like, I don't know, school sports, for example, a bunch of arsehole adults try to keep them from doing it.
And the very same Matt that said to let kids speak for themselves, saying Oliver didn't let them speak, that they had no opinion shown, also cut the compilation Oliver played of trans kids and youth allies defending their rights to equal spaces.
Young people are showing up in public forums where adults are fear-mongering about letting trans kids into youth sports and bathrooms and trying to talk some sense into them.
I will not let a board full of people who barely represent me tell me who I am and what I can do. Grow up and fix your behavior.
I'm not worried about a trans person harassing me. I'm worried about if I'm gonna fail Spanish in my next class.
I have used these bathrooms repeatedly alongside trans people and have never once felt threatened. You know who I have felt threatened by? The actions of this school board.
You've embarrassed yourselves, Gardner, and the state of Kansas for your lack of knowledge in sex and gender studies. You've also highlighted the severely inadequate sex education we give our students today.
He also cut out the well-explained breakdown of what gender care is and how it affects kids, dispelling the common sense notions that Matt so proudly touts.
So the benefits of providing care are immense and the risks of withholding it are dire. A survey of around 28,000 trans people found that of those who wanted hormone therapy and didn't receive it, 58% reported suicidal thoughts in a given year, which is why the three major professional associations of child and adolescent doctors, psychologists, and psychiatrists have endorsed gender-affirming care and condemned efforts to deny it. And you may have seen or heard from a small subset of people who detransitioned, but it is worth knowing such cases are rare and highly individualized. Studies show an average of just 2% of people who transition express regret, and that the vast majority of those who have opted to detransition did so not because of changes in their gender identity, but due to external factors such as stigma and lack of social support.
Even in the takedowns where he's directly addressing something, he's outdone. If you've ever been convinced by Matt's appeals to common sense or logic, please actually look into what he's saying, because almost 100% of the time, those words are just shorthand for his opinion that he is convinced himself is the only correct answer. Real science and facts be damned. And if you want a thorough, concise debunking of Matt's rhetoric around trans people, go check out Jessie Gender's video where she dismantles what is a woman and goes in depth into things like the history of trans people, various societies that have had trans people throughout history, the science, biology, and psychiatry behind the trans debate, and a ton more stuff that makes Matt look like an idiot. Mostly because I don't have time to disprove everything he says. He's been wrong a lot, and look, he's had like a decade of a head start. Of course, Matt hides much of the reasons for his transphobia as being both protecting women and preventing a slippery slope. The slippery slope fallacy is the same conservative nonsense they've been peddling forever, asking if gay people get married, where does it end? And the answer is always the same. Somewhere. It ends somewhere, like with gay people getting married. He's resorted to some creative arguments to justify his bigotry. In another blog post, he goes on at length, equivocating an incestuous headline-making couple to queer people for no real reason, just reiterating the same steep slope fallacy, and that things like legalizing gay marriage would lead to open pedophilia, something he still pushes today, just mostly against trans people.
The people that are pushing transgenderism on kids are also at the same time, by necessity, pushing an entirely different idea about consent and about the mental capacities and the maturity of children. Which is why I believe the people that are pushing transgenderism will soon enough be pushing pedophilia. The two things kind of go hand in hand. Because in order to make their case that kids can make this choice, they have to tell us that actually no, kids have all the knowledge and power and maturity that they need. So when pedophilia is normalized in our culture, and I think that it will be soon enough, this is the vehicle by which it will reach that state of normalization. And this is the reason why. This is one of the reasons why this issue really matters. This is why it's important.
Then there's his defense of women and women's spaces. Despite his constant willingness to make women suffer things like stillborn children against medical advice, Matt sees himself as an advocate for women, as long as they're pro-life and agree with him and do everything he thinks is right, of course. Most recently, he went viral for just ripping into a lady who made a video blog about having a day off with no kids. His arguments have gone something like this in the past.
Every few months we get another attempt by a childless woman, it is almost always a woman, to try and convince us that it's actually a great idea to live only for yourself and die by yourself and make yourself into an ancestral dead end, leaving behind no progeny and no legacy. And every once in a while, the woman making this case is someone other than Chelsea Handler. Now, there are some studies that will insist that people without kids are, in fact, much happier than people with kids. If you Google it right now, I'm sure there are people furiously Googling it so they can disprove me with science. And they can leave a comment saying, no, Matt, scientifically you're wrong, okay? Because science has measured human happiness and fulfillment. And you see it's been tabulated here on this bar graph, and obviously, clearly you're wrong. And if you Google it, you will find, you'll see a headline saying that people without kids are way happier than people with kids. Take some woman who chose profession, career, success over family, over kids. Yeah, right now, when she's relaxing and she's getting ready for her third vacation of the year, yeah, maybe she'll say, oh, I'm so happy. And she comes home every day to her great, wonderful, nice house that the housekeeper has kept in great shape, and she's got all this nice stuff, all this nice, wonderful stuff, but nobody there to use it. And she's got all this space, but nobody to fill it with. And all these rooms, but no one to sleep in. And she can take any vacation she wants, but she's been on all the exotic vacations. They've lost their novelty by now. And also, frankly, it's kind of depressing to go on vacation by yourself. And most of the people at work are much younger than her, but the people that she knows, her friends who are her age, most of them they're planning weddings for their grown children. They're going to baptisms for their grandchildren. They're planning family reunions. They have all these landmarks coming up. They've got the grandchildren coming over on the weekend. They're going to go over a picnic. They're going to go down to the lake. They've got this whole thing planned. And her, all she's got is herself. Her loneliness, her success. Ask her then how happy she is.
I'm on a Saturday. I'm 29 and single, and I don't have kids yet. Here's what your Saturday morning looks like when you're single at 29 and you don't have a kid running around the house. I didn't rise from my bed until 10:15. Every time I thought, I should probably get up and do something. I thought, why? Nobody's making me. I'm not missing out on anything.
And I do quite passionately oppose the promotion of childlessness and the idea that we should spend our young adulthood focused on self-centered pursuits and mindless amusements. I very much oppose that idea. I think it leads to despair and societal decay. I think that if a critical mass of people adopt this approach, it would eventually brings about the collapse of human civilization.
So again, Matt doesn't really care about women or their personal agency. He doesn't like them when they confront him or when they're more educated. He doesn't like them if they don't fit his definitions of beauty. He doesn't like them when they don't have kids and just lead a successful life. He does seem to care about it when it comes to their achievements in sports or bathrooms. Mostly those things. While he doesn't like to talk much about it today because of his big spotlight, he's also not so subtly advocated violence against trans people over bathrooms in the past. Like this article where he openly fantasizes about it. Matt just dislikes diversity of any stripe, if it wasn't obvious by how he belittles queer people and women so far. In this blog post, Matt whines about someone who's emailed him after his bigoted disdain for marriage equality. Matt asserts with no proof that diversity in America is just a self-centered attempt by people of varying sexes and ethnicities to destroy classic values. He then challenges those people to be more tolerant of people like him and his opinions, that those people shouldn't exist. In another blog post, Matt whines in much the same way, though framing his own admitted status as an introvert as a kind of special group that should be considered. Again, we see Matt taking mild criticism as deeply personal and lashing out against it. However, if you'll remember, Matt Walsh believes in extremes. He believes that there is only one way forward, so he's advocating others accept him, but not that he has to also accept others. This is another thing we see all the time. For example, Matt doesn't seem to think there's a problem with racial slurs. These opinions go hand in hand with Matt's definition fixation, where he doesn't think there's any such thing as hate speech, just like there's no such thing as hate crime. He doesn't think anyone else should get accommodated for diversity because he doesn't as a straight white man, except when he wants to feel persecuted for being an introvert or being Christian. The way he navigates the world through his grievances just feels like he goes, "I know you are, but what am I?" to every problem that crosses his path. He's never needed nuance or actual proof or science on his side because there has always been enough people in a room who will cheer for him, no matter what incendiary things he's saying or how much bullshit he's spewing. Name a far-right conservative position, Matt Walsh probably has it. He's anti-woke, anti-trans, and gay, anti-indigenous, pro-Second Amendment, anti-choice, etc. To his credit, he's not explicitly against people of different skin tones, however, he is anti-immigration, so damning with faint praise, I guess. And like many conservatives, many of his principles are guided by religion, his Catholicism. So, what happens when someone who considers it a virtue to remain ignorant, someone like Matt who always needs to feel superior, is confronted with heinous crimes he can't personally wave away? Well, when that happens, Matt Walsh will run cover for some real pieces of shit. Now, you might ask how Matt, who seems to shut down and retaliate against anything infringing on his rigid worldview, has reacted to the ongoing and nearly constant slew of sexual abuse claims against the Catholic Church. I'm glad you asked. By completely deflecting from the issue and not blaming the church itself, but gay people.
Okay, the problem isn't pedophilia. Unlike what we're told and what you hear in the media about all the so-called pedophile priests and so on, the problem is not pedophilia. The problem is gay priests in the church.
However, the John Jay report shows that of the staggering amount of abuse in the church, there was 20% of that is women. Matt is also leaving out that this isn't an equal opportunity abuse thing, as choir boys and altar boys are positions that are well known to be preyed on for a reason. They're readily available to priests and clergy. Also, a majority of child sex offenders aren't gay or exclusively homosexual, as data shows. I hate so deeply looking this shit up because the state of abuse and abusers in this country is so repulsive it makes my skin crawl. I hate people who abuse kids, but almost as much, I despise the people who want to pull the spotlight away from the real culprits. And Matt does so in a variety of ways, attempting to lay blame at the feet of gay people almost exclusively. Because he's too much of a coward to come out against something like his faith, an institution that has hurt so many. In keeping with his obsession with oversimplification, Matt makes the argument that by definition, molester priests are gay, when in reality more often it's rooted in power fantasies. He also explains that pedophilia is by definition not prepubescent, which, fucking gross, dude.
This is what statistics show. And most prominently, there was something called the John Jay report that was, I think, the most extensive report published on the sex scandal in the church. And it shows that the vast majority of victims were male, and the vast majority were not prepubescent children. And pedophilia, by definition, is the sexual assault of a prepubescent child. So, by definition, most of this was not pedophilia.
When talking about public schools later, he basically blames abuse on the fact that teachers in their 20s are in charge of teenagers. Basically blaming them for being young enough to still be attracted to teenagers, by the way.
It's probably not a good idea to have women in their 20s teaching teenage boys. Just like it's probably not a good idea to have men in their 20s teaching teenage girls. And it may be true that we don't have much of a choice in the public school system, and that probably is accurate, but there are serious problems inherent in this arrangement, and we are seeing those problems bear themselves out.
Oh, and he also defended and continued to defend Josh Duggar, an inhuman slug who deserves to be have his like that one scene in Inglourious Bastards, nailed to a head upside down and be with a rusty tire iron. For those who don't remember, Josh Duggar sexually assaulted his own sisters and collected a wide variety of child exploitation materials that included torture porn and real-life snuff films. Yet, Matt still wrote a blog post where he doubts if his son had done the same thing as Josh, if he'd be able to go to the proper authorities. But sure, he can claim a moral high ground on anything. And of course, Matt's ever-present lack of self-awareness means that in addition to deflecting blame and defending sex abusers, Matt has also run interference for alt-right shooters, especially as his openly extremist and controlling rhetoric has worked its way to a more mainstream conservative audience. For example, when he basically blamed queer people for the Club Q shooting, despite the fact that he had been pushing conspiracies about drag queens and grooming kids.
According to the left, the drag queen child combination has become dangerous. They say it's a lightning rod for violent backlash. Right? That's what they said. And it's greatly exaggerated, of course. Mostly it's invented out of whole cloth, actually. But even by their version of events, if it's causing this much chaos and violence, why do you insist on continuing to do it?
Just look at how he treats other shootings, by the way, with skepticism, with questions. Until the trans shooter, until one that really fit his agenda. No, that one gets a crisp, clear headline. We know what happened there. He'd rather blame the media that reports on a shooting than the manifestos citing his own political alignments. Because he's too much of a coward to admit roles that he might have played in implicit violence against innocent people.
But there's something else. There's another ingredient, I think, that's needed in order to make a mass killer. And I think you can see that ingredient, you can observe it by looking at the kinds of people who excitedly exploit these kinds of events and practically cheer when the culprit ends up being someone from the other side. Because those people, it really seems like they are happy when this happens. They are happy when it happens if it's something that they can use. There are people like this. That's really what it seems like. They would never say that. They would never be explicit about it. They would never admit it. But when you listen to them, when you see the way they carry on, there doesn't appear to be any sadness. There is no moment of somber reflection or compassion. It is just, I'm going to grab this thing right after the bodies have hit, a second after the bodies hit the ground. I'm going to grab it and I'm going to use it as a club to beat my political enemies with. As I have tried to warn for a long time, radical far-left trans activism is a hateful, violent movement. It is more hateful and more violent than any other movement in memory, that these people will do and say anything to those they consider their enemies. Anything. They will do anything to intimidate and silence you. They will dox you, they will blackmail you, they will threaten you, they will call for violence against you, they will threaten your family, they will threaten your children, they will harass you, they will commit violence against you. You know, the trans activists are assured that somehow those who disagree with them are a threat to their very lives, just by disagreeing. That those who do not affirm their self-identity are engaging in violence simply by not affirming. that the refusal to affirm is essentially an act of murder. But we're not the ones, as Christians and conservatives, we're not the ones who have reason to be concerned, right? It's the trans people. It's the trans activists who are carrying out this kind of stuff. They're the ones who we need to be worried about. And also what you heard at the end there from the Human Rights Campaign. Trans people are much more likely to be victims of violence. Now, if the insinuation there, which this is what is being insinuated, if the claim is that they're much more likely to be violence, if they're much more likely to be targeted for violence because they are trans, if that's the claim, then it is totally bogus. Because we hear so much about trans people being killed, genocide, they're being targeted because they're trans. It almost never happens. Okay? It almost never happens. There is no epidemic of it. There's nothing like that. Which is why, as we've been over many times, when they try to support this claim of a genocide or hate crime epidemic against trans people, the most they can ever do is just is give you the number of trans people who are homicide victims, period, throughout the entire year. So they'll tell you, well, whatever it is, 50 trans people were the victims of homicide throughout the year. Oh, okay, yeah, I mean, you take any demographic group and there's going to be homicides within that group, because we're all mortal human beings living in this society. The question is, how many of the homicides were because they're trans? How many of them were targeted because of their identity?
Matt Walsh doesn't actually care about the kids that die in shootings, by the hands of a trans killer or not. He cares about the Second Amendment rights, so he will give thoughts and prayers. Just like he doesn't care about women or their babies, he cares about forcing others to live by the standards he deems acceptable. And just like he doesn't actually care about protecting kids from pedophiles and groomers, because if he did, he wouldn't defend them and try to distract from them so fucking much. And most of the time, he could just ignore these clear lapses in logic, hand wave them away. But Matt is so dedicated to his worldview where everyone is wrong except him, where his chosen path is the only correct one, that he can't even reckon with the horror of something like child abuse. He would rather keep deflecting to a scapegoat than admit there's a hole in his armor. And I think in those introspective moments, he knows this. He tries to laugh it off and use his withering sarcasm to deflect and troll his opposition.
I don't care how you feel. I don't apologize to you. Your feelings are irrelevant to me. I don't care if you have PTSD for the rest of your life because of what I said. I'll sleep like a baby tonight anyway. In fact, I'll laugh at you. I'm happy about it. I'm happy I upset you. I don't care about your feelings.
But the truth is that he's stuck in a hell he's created for himself. Because he is so unwaveringly steadfast in his own beliefs and so against anything else, Matt Walsh lives in a world of constant offense. As he'd like to imagine, one where he's the one offending everybody else, who have been simplified to whimpering blue-haired liberals cowering from his intellectual might in their safe spaces. But the reality, as we've seen, is more the opposite. Because he so readily hates anything different, anything that threatens his preconceived notions, Matt Walsh walks through life always offended. Offended by simple differences in taste over movies, by service animals, by drag queen story time, by people celebrating who they are. And while he tries to cloak it in attempts at humor and cynicism, what kind of person who is happy with their life spends so much effort and so many years of it bitching about every inconsequential thing? It makes me wonder, what does Matt Walsh actually like? The cheap shot here would be to say that Matt loves hating other people, and yeah, that is at least partially true. If nothing else, we've seen he loves the satisfaction of watching the hordes he inspires take action against the targets he designates. But more than that, what does Matt Walsh actually like? He's known even by other Daily Wire people as a grump. They disagree with him all the time, even on simple, inconsequential things. To his credit, Matt seems to enjoy the company of his wife. And Jeopardy, I guess. As he writes in this blog post, extolling her ability to admire his profound Jeopardy gifts. Okay, what movies does he like? Doesn't like Star Wars, doesn't like musicals, or big action movies. I went looking and found this list he did on the best movies of the last 20 years. These are just dude movies. Regular ass movies. He likes John Wayne too, I guess. Apparently he even watches The Office.
Nothing wrong with reruns, personally, but I've seen each episode of The Office like 26 times. Seasons 1 through 4, the other seasons don't count in my opinion.
Matt Walsh doesn't play video games, as evidenced by the Daily Wire's attempts to help humanize him to the youths with the gratingly edited Matt Walsh Plays video game series.
And which one am I?
You're the blue guy.
Okay, blue guy. Now hold on, wait, don't hit me yet. Don't hit me. Stop, time out. Stop a second. Let me figure out the buttons first. What the hell? How many moves are there?
There's a lot. So look, if you
I
just
feel like I'm in medical school. I got to memorize all this information.
look, if you just go back to the game, look, don't come near me. Push triangle.
All right, I'm gonna push it in a second.
Yes, I watched those too for you. For music, we know he has simple taste because he liked this ass clown and hates pop. He doesn't talk much about what music he does like, though I'm gonna say he doesn't like rap because of the shitty sarcastic review videos he continues to do. Though he did say nice to someone mentioning Metallica once, so maybe that's a clue?
A Metallica song.
Nice.
That I played from a boombox for the recessional hymn.
In his favor, he does seem to read a lot, even though most of his books come from a generic list of Western classics and military history books. But when it comes to physical art, he spent a decade talking about how awful modern art is, but his biggest points of artistic value are things like the Pietà. I'm not saying he hasn't read any books on art or famous artists, but if he has, I doubt he's read many that'll challenge his worldview. Like, I know I've been critical, but it's truly mind-blowing. When you look at all the stuff Matt hates or rails against, compared to all the stuff he cites or likes, it's staggering for someone who has made a living criticizing media, how little of it he seems to have consumed or acknowledges. Like, if you're going to talk about how reductive a piece of art is, or talk about how bland or banal something is, you better be bringing some serious niche cred, dude. Most of his criticisms of things like pop music are painfully skin deep because that's the extent of his understanding of art in general. It might explain why his primary critique of Les Mis was, nuh-uh, it's not a classic, because despite wanting to seem like he advocates for artistic integrity and quality of art, much like with science, Matt doesn't seem to know what the hell he's talking about. He might be well-read in certain military conflicts or campaigns, but his overall incuriosity has played into his rigid, safe space worldview. By now, I've read through most of Matt Walsh's 5+ year-long blog, watched dozens of hours of Daily Wire broadcasts, and spelunked into the deep, dark depths of his cerebellum. And if you're wondering where someone like Matt Walsh comes from, we know the answer to that. They come from all over. Don't even look at what he hates. Look at what he likes, the things he allows close enough to define him. They're painfully average, easily accessible, widely known. For all his moral grandstanding, his love of being depicted as a crusader, and his spiteful trolling, Matt Walsh is just a normal, unremarkable man. And he has surrounded himself with things that remind him of that. And instead of trying to learn more and escape that prison, he closes himself further off. If there's one thing I've learned during this video, and one lesson I'd like to be taken from studying this bigot, it's that nothing good comes of proud ignorance and incuriosity. We can always continue to learn, but we also need to be willing to understand. Of all ages and creeds, races and backgrounds, there have always been people like Matt Walsh who insist that their view of the world is the only correct one because any infringement on that would mean slight discomfort. Matt Walsh isn't a new or brave speaker. He's the reincarnation of peasants who lived and died attesting the world was flat while never leaving the same village. He's the kind of man who would have tried treating hay fever with leeches even as the town's fancy college doctor said it wouldn't help. He's ignorant because that ignorance affords him a refuge from having to self-reflect and maybe admit he doesn't know everything. And there are so many people like him, people out there who don't have any willingness to learn, to have their mind changed, to get along with their fellow man because of the inconvenience it may bring, even momentarily. We know what people like Matt Walsh want, what drives them. It's their inherent feelings of superiority over their fellow person, and the need that comes with those feelings to subjugate anything they don't understand. But it's a self-replicating problem. They don't understand anything or anyone else because they choose not to, which in turn leads them to spite and hate. Much like his opinions seemingly haven't changed since 2011, neither has Matt's desire to belittle others. to hold himself as inherently superior by simply being. He doesn't have any reason to find that valid. He's not more educated, he's not smarter, he's not more righteous, he's not perfect. But he so desperately wants to be all of those things. Think of how personally he takes everything. The way he uses sarcasm to try and cover his tracks, and so quickly resorts to childish playground insults when criticized. His smug sense of superiority might seem like a bit, a facade to keep those liberal tears flowing, but look at how he really reacts to the world. To things he might not understand the appeal of, or might not understand at all. When you take into account everything Matt believes, but also how he goes about showing that belief, his self-righteousness feels less like an act and more like a mask, one that he can use to hide his numerous insecurities behind vicious morning zoo crew comedy that will delight his equally ignorant base. But really, I think he's jealous. I don't think Matt Walsh is a closeted trans person or gay or secretly liberal, but I think he is jealous when he sees many of the people he criticizes. The secret is how viciously he goes after them. Note how much more defensive and confrontational he is when he feels his education or intelligence is questioned. Now consider how fervently he's railed against education, with many signs pointing to him feeling personally slighted by his time in school. Or notice how Matt has talked about introspection, and how he's been incredibly self-critical of his own appearance and his own mannerisms. Then contrast that with his fixations on modern aesthetics and beauty, particularly when it comes to someone accepting themselves and finding themselves worthy of being attractive. And finally, think back to his almost rabid denial of ADHD, the way he conflates it with a mental illness. Then think of all the ways he uses mental illness as a cudgel in his arguments. Think of how he views diversity not as a strength, but as a weakness. Like so many modern conservatives, Matt Walsh is insecure about so many things in the constantly changing worlds he finds himself in. And so lashes out at those differences by attempting to lock himself in a box. Because at heart, Matt Walsh will only ever be a shock jock. His sole purpose is to be a wrecking ball of controversy, pissing off some people while making others laugh. And you might get through all this and not feel any pity for Matt Walsh after the monsters he's defended, the lies he's told, the reprehensible beliefs he's espoused. But after this long, deep dive into who he is, I can't help but feel a little bad, because deep down, Matt Walsh won't ever contribute more to society than to be a stepping stool for the agendas of others. He's created a prison for himself where everything is out to get him personally because he is committed to ignorance above all else. He has decided to live a life of constant anger, offense, malice at every little thing he sees fit. Matt Walsh is a coward who's afraid to admit to himself how wrong he is, and instead would rather focus on how he is victimized, how he's slighted by people who don't affect his life at all. He can't help but be mad and lash out at people who accept others and accept themselves, who see broader definitions and understand more about the world than he does, because really, I think he wishes he could do all of those things, but he's too afraid to admit it. And the really sad part is that I think he knows it. Hello everyone, and thank you for sticking with this second video. As I mentioned in the last part, I had not intended for an examination of Matt Walsh to balloon to such a massive degree, but it turns out it takes a long time to show how someone can be wrong when they're wrong in so many ways, and such a baby about it. First, I want to thank a very special donation that has allowed me to get a new tripod and lighting, so if the wiggly camera bothered you, it won't be a problem in future videos. Next up, we'll be getting a proper HD camera and soundproofing, so I want to thank everyone who's donated and supported on Patreon for helping me so much with the production here. Speaking of which, if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving a few bucks to the Patreon, where you can get updates on upcoming videos and streams, other projects of mine like cosplay photo sets, rough drafts of novels, and more. Or you can just give a few bucks at the links below. I am doing this as a full-time job now, and I'm constantly striving to tackle bigger and harder subjects, so the support has allowed me to focus and tackle in-depth issues like this one with the attention they deserve. If you couldn't tell by the 60, 70, I've lost count how many videos I had to source for this, this has been a very large undertaking, and I appreciate all the support I've gotten. And finally, I want to update everyone and say I'll be taking a slight break for October to focus on gaming and pop culture on the channel. I have old video essays I'll be posting, new essays like one on Silent Hill 3 and another on Shadows of the Damned, and plenty of streams mostly focusing on horror gaming content, so I hope you stick around and enjoy, and come November I'll be digging back into political content in a big bad way with my next deep dive project, which I will announce at a later time. In closing, I hope you have found this look into the banal, miserable mind of Matt Walsh enlightening as a charting of how someone can delude themselves into hating anything they don't understand. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.